I'm Sarah Butcher, and this is The Side Comment. In this episode, Michael Sheridan discusses the challenges faced when writing about modern China and what he was able to uncover about the British and Chinese negotiations over the 1997 transfer of Hong Kong.
One of the challenges in writing about modern China is access to research and resources. Information is kept fairly tightly controlled inside the People's Republic. It's an authoritarian state. It has no concept of public access to documentation or the public's right to know. However, I was very fortunate in writing The Gate to China because I had excellent research help inside China, research, translation, searching documents, and reviewing the large amount of literature that exists on the process of reform and opening up, which began under Deng Xiaoping after 1978. There were various open access archives which contain key documents and speeches and edicts from that period. They're principally available in the Guangdong Province Provincial Archives. We've found in the past, other historians have found that the provincial archives in China are a rich seam of data, because many of the edicts and documents which issued from Beijing were copied there and therefore are available. In the Guangdong archives, we see really remarkable testimony to how the Chinese had a far-sighted view of reform and opening up. There are speeches by the man who led the process in the late 1970s, a man called Xi Zhongxun, who is the father of the present leader of China, Xi Jinping. Xi Zhongxun was a remarkable figure who came from a revolutionary background. He was a guerrilla and a militant. He was purged in the Cultural Revolution and spent many years in detention and provincial exile. He was restored to power, and the documents show that he took a very firm hand of Guangdong under Deng Xiaoping's leadership and came to the conclusion that China could not go on as it was. He went by himself, first-hand, to the border areas. He saw poverty among Chinese villagers after 30 years of socialism. He saw thousands of them trying to flee to British Hong Kong, and he went back and reported to the Central Committee that things could not go on like this. He called it a front line that was the poverty line. And this vision by Xi Zhongxun developed into the blueprint for the rapid industrialization and modernization of South China, which opened up its economy to the outside world, created this formidable export machine, and allowed China to take its place as one of the world's preeminent trading powers again. Now, all this documentation is publicly available. This is a success story for China. The next part of the story comes in the Chinese dedication to recovering Hong Kong from its British holders. And here we have a series of memoirs written on the Chinese side of those negotiations, which have never really been reviewed before in the West. Clearly, sinologists and specialists will have read them, but the general reader in the Western countries has no idea how the Chinese saw Hong Kong. It was seen very much as a wound in the body politic of China. The wars of the 19th century inflicted great damage on the political psyche of the Chinese hierarchy and leadership. The world view of China as the centre of things was badly shaken. And so recovering Hong Kong was a principal task not merely for communists, not merely for Marxist-Leninists, but for those who saw themselves as the incarnation of the Chinese nation. Deng Xiaoping picked up that baton and took a very hard line quite early on. And what was remarkable here is that the Chinese side assembled a cast of negotiators and politicians who essentially took charge of the Hong Kong dossier for almost 30 years. And the key figures are people we've barely heard of in the West. A man called Liao Chengzhe, who was the mastermind of relations with Japan and invented the concept which came to be known as one country, two systems. There was another remarkable man called Li Chang, who was the foreign trade minister. Nominally, he was in reality a key intelligence operative and a great advisor to Mao Zedong. We have biographies of these people, and then on the Chinese side, the people involved in the negotiations, like Zhao Nan and Lu Ping, wrote their own memoirs or gave oral histories. So we now have the two sides of the negotiations, the Chinese side, led by Deng Xiaoping, and the British side, led by Margaret Thatcher. What comes out of the joint examination of these documents is a much more balanced view of the negotiated return of Hong Kong to China and an understanding of why that came about. In the Thatcher papers, which I examined in Churchill College, Cambridge, we now see declassified secret conversations between Mrs. Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping and the Premier Zhao Ziyang. And in those conversations, a very firm, hard line on both sides. And it comes down to one big principle is of great interest to historians, and that is why treaties matter. Hong Kong was held by the British under 3 treaties. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 gave Britain possession of Hong Kong Island forever. There was then a second war between the Western powers and China, which led to the First Convention of Beijing in 1860, under which Britain got a bit more of Hong Kong forever. That convention was also signed, by the way, by France and Russia, so it was not a unique British deed in relation to the Qing Empire. Finally, after the wars of the 1890s and subsequent defeats by the foreign powers of the Chinese state, there was a series of leases and conventions by which China surrendered chunks of its territory to an array of foreign powers. And under that second convention of Beijing in 1898, Britain gained all the new territories on a lease of 99 years. Why did Britain not ask for that land forever, in perpetuity? Partly it was balance of power politics. The British government at the time did not want to set a precedent which would encourage other European powers and rivals to seize chunks of China in perpetuity. So in a way, the decisions of 1898 paved the way for the result of 1997, which was that the lease was running out. Britain and China had to negotiate about it. They then had to resolve the issue of how did you organise a transition of sovereignty when one power held 2 treaties granting it the land in perpetuity, and the other power was the grantor of a lease, allowing it to reclaim almost 90% of the land. It was a tangle. Mrs. Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping fought each other to try to resolve it. There were 2 clear principles. The documents show us that Deng Xiaoping resolved that he would take back all of Hong Kong. Mrs. Thatcher, for her part, said, no, there are 2 valid international treaties, the Treaty of Nanjing and the First Convention of Beijing, which grant the UK possession of Hong Kong Island and a little bit of Kowloon in perpetuity. We can hang on to that land. Deng said, we're not having that, we're taking it all back. Now this posed a dilemma, not merely about the 5.5 million people who lived in Hong Kong at that time, but about the principle of international law. I interviewed the second last governor of Hong Kong, David Wilson, who was a figure at the core of all this from the 1970s until the early 1990s. He recalled that Mrs. Thatcher evoked the Latin phrase pacta sunt servanda, that pacts must be observed, that agreements must be kept. Why was this important? It was incredibly important because at the time the Cold War was on and the peace of the world depended on nations making pacts and treaties with each other and keeping them. The balance of strategic power between the United States and the Soviet Union was held in check by a series of agreements, treaties signed and agreed by both countries. So the principle was very important. The brutal truth is that this was not just about Hong Kong or the people of Hong Kong. It was a vital matter that China should be bound into the international system of keeping treaties. That is why Mrs. Thatcher, much against her will, agreed to negotiate a handover from Britain to Hong Kong, by which Parliament in London would agree to abrogate all those three treaties and restore all of Hong Kong to China. It was a very big move. It was a move with drastic consequences for the people. Mrs. Thatcher herself had doubts about it, but it did establish one core principle, and that was that nations do not break treaties, but they alter them by negotiation. That is what Deng Xiaoping secured. It's what Mrs. Thatcher conceded. It's one of the hidden aspects of the fate of Hong Kong, but it's quite an important one, because in the 1980s, if China had simply broken treaty after treaty with impunity, Mrs. Thatcher and people like her who grew up in the 1930s could see again the process by which rising powers shattered the old order and perhaps led to conflict. So this was a bargain not merely on a local but on a strategic level. China itself recognized that treaties were important. It signed the Joint Declaration of 1984, by which it undertook to give the people of Hong Kong rights and freedoms for 50 years after the handover. That is a treaty registered at the United Nations. In recent years, Chinese diplomats have said it doesn't really count and it's no longer valid, but that is not actually the case. It remains valid. And China has sought a kind of legality of its own, a socialist legality, if you like, in putting in place the basic law of Hong Kong in 1990, which also underwrote those freedoms and rights, but with significant caveats. And then in 2020, after years of protests and violence and conflict, China imposed a national security law passed by its own parliament in Beijing. This was, in the end, the concluding document to this long sequence of documents which have governed Hong Kong. In essence, it brings Hong Kong under the vague but absolutist powers that reign over the rest of China. The fate of the Joint Declaration of 1984 and other agreements and statements which China has made about Hong Kong are now the subject of debates. We won't know until the Chinese archives one day open up and Chinese historians can look at them. What were the real debates going on inside China, and what were the decisions that they made and why did they make them? But I think in this book and this examination of the treaties and the negotiations, we have made a start in doing so.